Today, we are plunging into a topic that has really commanded intense public focus and, frankly, a heartbreaking sense of urgency: the pervasive reality of online cruelty and cyberbullying in Canada.
It's a huge topic, and this isn't just a national discussion, it's really a global crisis in governance.
How so?
Well, the core question is, how do we regulate digital spaces? These are places that are fundamentally borderless, they're fluid, often anonymous. And at the same time, how do you find that precise balance between protecting the most vulnerable members of society, we're talking particularly about children and youth, and maintaining core democratic freedoms like expression and privacy?
Right.
It is, I think, maybe the most challenging legislative task of our generation.
Absolutely. And for years in Canada, this challenge has been, well, it's been galvanized by these tragic high-profile cases. I'm thinking, of course, of Amanda Todd and Retta Parsons. They're stories where you see this relentless online harassment and the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. It played such a significant, fatal role. It put immense, almost overwhelming pressure on lawmakers to finally do something decisive.
And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. It's really twofold.
Okay.
First, we need to anchor this conversation in reality. So we're going to analyze the data. We'll look at the latest research that shows the lived experience of young Canadians dealing with this stuff.
You mean like how common it is, how they cope?
Exactly. How prevalent is it? How do they cope? And this is fascinating, the surprisingly blurry lines between who is a victim and who is an aggressor. Then second, we're going to juxtapose that data against the complex, comprehensive, and frankly sweeping federal legislative response: Canada's proposed Online Harms Act, which is currently known as Bill C-63.
And it's so important to note right up front, Bill C-63 is a massive piece of legislation. It's proposed, it's not law yet, and it is being intensely debated.
Intense.
So we need to go beyond the headlines and really understand not just what the government wants to regulate, but how this whole thing is structured, who holds the power, and what the real-world implications are for freedom of expression and, the future of the internet in Canada. Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start with the experiences of young people facing online cruelty. When we look at the latest data, this isn't some rare, isolated thing that happens to a few unlucky kids, is it?
Not at all. It's baked into the modern youth experience.
So what does the research tell us? How widespread is online meanness? And crucially, how do kids actually perceive it and respond to it?
Well, the data reveals that being involved in mean and cruel behavior online is a really common experience for a significant minority of students. This is particularly true as they enter and move through middle and high school.
A significant minority. What kind of numbers are we talking about?
When students were surveyed, a substantial 37% reported that someone has said or done something mean or cruel to them online.
37%. Wow. That's more than 1 in 3.
It is. It's a massive number.
That almost suggests that meanness is just normalized. But I guess we need to distinguish between, seeing one harsh comment versus suffering genuine, persistent harassment. How serious do the students themselves think it is?
That distinction, that nuance, is absolutely critical to understanding the problem the legislation is trying to solve. So, while 37% have been exposed to meanness, the harm isn't evenly distributed across that group at all.
Okay.
For the majority of those students, we're talking about 70% of them, they classify the meanness as rarely or never a problem for them personally.
So it happens, they sort of shrug it off and they move on.
Exactly. But that leaves a pretty significant segment where the exposure does translate into real harm.
So if 70% aren't seriously bothered, we're left with the remaining 30% of that group.
That's right. And for that group, which, if you do the math, translates to about 11% of the overall student sample, it is a serious, distressing problem. They classify it as a problem either sometimes or, for some, often.
So just to be clear, about 1 in 9 students is experiencing online meanness as a serious, persistent problem in their lives.
That's the takeaway. Even though generalized meanness might be common, that severe or persistent distress is highly concentrated among a smaller, particularly vulnerable group.
Are we seeing any patterns in who makes up that 11%? Who is statistically more vulnerable?
We certainly are. The data clearly shows vulnerability patterns linked to age and gender.
Oh.
Younger students, specifically those in grades 4 through 7, are statistically more likely to find online meanness a serious problem. They're, still developing the social and emotional tools to navigate digital conflict.
That makes sense.
And similarly, girls are consistently more likely than boys to report that this kind of behavior is a serious problem in their online lives.
So this concentration of harm It suggests that any effective solution can't be a blunt instrument, right? It has to be tailored to these specific vulnerabilities. Okay, so we have this core group, 11% of students, who are persistently distressed. How are they coping? I mean, they're experiencing this digital conflict. Are they using digital solutions like the block button or reporting tools, or are they seeking out, analog, real-world help?
This is where the data offers one of the most surprising insights.
Oh,
Despite the conflict being digital, the solutions are overwhelmingly analog. And parents play a massive role.
really?
The single most common response overall for dealing with both online meanness, that's 50% of students, and explicit online threats, 55%, is asking parents for help.
Half of all students, when faced with this stuff, immediately turn to a parent. That really flies in the face of the narrative that kids are completely independent online and hiding everything from their families.
It absolutely does. And this reliance is particularly strong for those younger students we just talked about, the 4th through 7th graders. They are highly dependent on adult intervention.
And I assume that drops off as they get older.
It does. As they age, that reliance naturally drops through high school, which you'd expect as they seek more autonomy. But even in grade 11, the reliance is still substantial. 19% still turn to parents for help with meanness, and a quarter of students, 26%, turn to parents when they're dealing with threats.
That's still a big number for 17-year-olds. It really reinforces that parents are like the essential first responders in any digital safety strategy.
They are.
But the coping mechanisms go beyond just parents, right? It moves into how they interact with their peers. And this is where it gets really interesting for me. The sources show that students often prefer face-to-face negotiation to resolve online clashes.
Yes. They're taking digital drama and forcing it back into the real world, back into the hallways and cafeterias to actually settle it.
Why do you think that is?
Well, that preference for analog solutions suggests a fundamental recognition on their part that, asynchronous screen-based communication is just it's deficient when it comes to resolving intense emotional conflicts.
The screen just makes it worse.
It often escalates misunderstanding, or it fails to provide the clarity and reconciliation they need. They're seeking out real-world cues, body language, tone of voice, to actually move past the conflict.
It also provides a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that this generation is passive or disengaged when they're facing conflict, especially when you look at bystander intervention.
Indeed. The data on bystander intervention is highly encouraging. 65% of students report that when they have seen someone being mean or cruel to another person online, they have actively done something to help.
65%.
Yeah.
That's a huge majority of young people choosing to intervene rather than just, scroll past.
It is.
Are there demographic differences here? Are girls still stepping up more than boys?
Yes, girls are statistically more likely than boys to report that they intervened. But what's fascinating is that the intervention rate is high even among those who have been involved in conflict themselves.
What do you mean?
Students who have been targets of cruel behavior, or even who have behaved cruelly towards others themselves, are more likely to report helping someone being picked on online.
That's complex.
It is, and it feeds directly into this concept of the bully victim.
Ah, right. The complicated dynamic of the bully victim. We're moving beyond that traditional clean division of a clear aggressor and a clear target that we saw in, playground bullying. The digital world seems to blur those roles almost instantly.
Precisely. So, to set the stage, let's just note the prevalence. 23% of students report that they themselves have been mean or cruel to someone online.
So if almost a quarter admit to it.
And what researchers note is that both being targeted and engaging in meanness rise throughout grades 4 to 8, and then they stabilize in the higher grades.
So grade 8 is the peak.
Grade 8 appears to be a real turning point, yeah. Potentially reflects the full integration of social media into their social fabric.
So how does this blurring of roles, how does the bully-victim dynamic actually emerge online?
It's often instantaneous and reciprocal. What begins as an offensive or mocking post about a youth often elicits an equally aggressive, mean, retaliatory response from the target.
Right, so they're just defending themselves.
In their eyes, yes. But once they post that aggressive response, both youth have now engaged in bullying behavior, and both are now victims of the other's actions. This hostile exchange quickly snowballs into a reciprocal conflict.
And then others jump in.
Exactly. Others take sides, creating even more bully victims.
So the conflict turns into this back-and-forth volley, where one person's action is immediately justified as retaliation by the other. It becomes almost impossible for an outside moderator or even a parent to figure out who started it or who the real victim is.
The quotes from youth themselves capture this perfectly. They say things like, victim and bully aren't clearly defined, it's just back and forth. And because the exchange is reciprocal, they often view their own hostile behavior as entirely defensible.
There's also a paradox that the sources highlight about these bully victims. They're often highly empathetic, yet they still engage in the very behavior that caused them pain. How do you reconcile that? High empathy with hurtful actions.
It's a remarkable cognitive dissonance, isn't it? Research shows that bully victims are often very adept at understanding others' perspectives and emotions. Highly empathetic, in other words. And yet, they engage in the very hurtful behavior they themselves have experienced and deeply understand the pain of. They operate simultaneously in the electronic and material worlds, administering and receiving bullying behavior, often with a clear understanding of the negative consequences.
Which suggests it's not about a simple power imbalance like traditional bullying.
Right. It may be less about a clear power differential and more about social signaling or reciprocal behavior, or, concerningly, maybe even viewed by some youth as a form of entertainment within a peer group. So if we connect this detailed data to the bigger picture, you can see the social dynamics are complex, they're personal, and they're often reciprocal.
But the harm from true cyberbullying, especially when images or reputation are involved, that's gravely amplified by the technology itself, isn't it? The sheer scale, the speed, the permanence.
That unique amplification is exactly what legislators have to confront when they're drafting a new act.
It seems like the technology act as an accelerant and like a permanent archive for what used to be a temporary, isolated peer conflict. Can you define those unique harms of online violence that distinguish it from, face-to-face bullying?
The primary difference really comes down to scale and permanence. Unlike a verbal confrontation on a street corner, online content has a significantly longer shelf life.
It's there forever.
It can be accessible indefinitely unless it's taken down. And even if a victim successfully gets the content removed from one platform, it may have already been copied, archived, and spread to hundreds, if not thousands, of other sites.
Instantly giving it a wider audience.
A wider audience that's virtually unlimited. And crucially, control over the dispersal of those posts is entirely outside the victim's influence once they lose possession of the content.
That loss of control must be devastating, especially when the harm is gendered, which the research shows it frequently is. This isn't just generalized meanness, it's often targeted violence.
It is essential to recognize this as a pervasive form of gender-based violence that's often dismissed as just online drama.
Do we have numbers on that?
According to a 2018 survey, 18% of women in Canadian provinces experienced unwanted sexual behavior online. But when you look closer at vulnerable groups, those rates just skyrocket.
For instance,
33% of women aged 15 to 24, 30% of Indigenous women, and a shocking 50% of bisexual women reported experiencing online harassment in the previous 12 months.
50%, half.
Half. This highlights that technology-facilitated violence disproportionately impacts marginalized groups.
So if you're a young woman, a member of the LGBTQ2S+ community, or an Indigenous woman, your risk is just drastically higher. What are the measurable consequences of being subjected to this kind of online attack?
The consequences are comprehensive. They span psychological, sexual, and economic harm. Psychologically, victims frequently suffer from severe depression, anxiety, chronic fear, and tragically heightened suicidal tendencies. Sexually, harassment is rampant, alongside the non-consensual sharing of intimate images.
And economically?
Economically, perpetrators can post information or photos that severely hinder the victim's ability to find work or retain employment, leading to financial instability and reputational damage.
The impact forces victims to retreat.
Yes. Faced with this barrage, 28% of women in that survey reported taking protective measures like deleting their accounts entirely or significantly reducing their time online.
Which leads to this profound social isolation. The very connection the internet is supposed to provide is lost because the victimization forces the victim offline.
Exactly.
So given that the harm is so immense and amplified by technology, we have to ask why the government felt the need for a massive legislative overhaul like Bill C-63. What was so wrong with the existing legal toolkit?
Well, the Criminal Code of Canada certainly already addressed extreme cyberbullying and violence. We have established tools to capture conduct at the upper end of the spectrum.
Like what?
Things like criminal harassment, which is Section 264, uttering threats, extortion, incitement of hatred, and the specific offense of non-consensual distribution of intimate images.
Those sound sufficient for egregious behavior. So were the laws just designed for the 19th or 20th century, making them functionally useless now?
In many cases, yes. The Criminal Code Working Group identified a serious modernization problem. Take, for instance, Section 372 of the Criminal Code. It deals with false messages and indecent or harassing communications.
Okay.
It prohibits conduct committed through older technology specified explicitly as letters, telegrams, telephones, or cable.
Telegrams. It's a perfect example of a law that completely missed the modern digital revolution.
Exactly. It's difficult to apply those sections effectively to modern methods like text, email, or social media without, legal gymnastics because the specific means of communication listed are obsolete.
So the old laws weren't necessarily too soft, they were just structurally outdated.
They lacked technological fluidity. The working group explicitly supported amending these offenses to refer generally to any means of telecommunication to future-proof the law.
Beyond that practical problem of outdated language, there's a broader philosophical question about relying too heavily on criminal law for youth offenders. That's central to the data we saw earlier about bully victims.
There is a strong consensus among child advocates that caution is absolutely necessary when applying the full weight of the criminal law to youth perpetrators. We have to remember that sometimes these actions reflect immaturity or recklessness, not malicious, long-term intent.
Right. And criminalizing children can have these permanent, life-altering consequences.
Precisely. Consequences beyond just a fine or jail time. Organizations like UNICEF Canada noted that criminalization risks inflicting severe reputational damage, permanent stigma affecting their access to education and employment for decades.
And even self-harm.
Yes, and even increasing potential acts of self-harm resulting from a crushing sense of embarrassment and humiliation. So criminal law should be reserved only for the most extreme, persistent, and harmful cases.
Which is a tension, I guess, that Bill C-63 tries to resolve by shifting the burden of accountability away from the individual user and onto the corporation, the platform itself. Okay, so what does this all mean? We have an urgent problem amplified by technology, existing laws that are structurally outdated and insufficient, and this clear mandate for caution when it comes to criminalizing youth. This brings us to the proposed federal solution, the Online Harms Act. And this isn't a simple update, is it? This is Canada attempting a complete systems-based regulatory reboot.
That is the essential takeaway. The Online Harms Act proposes a new regulatory regime intended to hold social media services, the companies who profit from the content, accountable for reducing user exposure to harmful content.
So the government is basically saying the platforms are primarily responsible for the risk their systems create.
That's right. And the goal, crucially, is mitigating, not eliminating risk. They want to do it through baseline safety requirements that are flexible and intended to evolve with technology.
What types of services are we talking about here? And what content specifically triggers these huge new duties on the platforms?
So the Act would apply to what it defines as regulated services. That's specifically social media services that enable users to communicate content to the public.
So not private messaging apps.
Generally not. It wouldn't apply to private messaging features like Signal or WhatsApp that have end-to-end encryption, nor to websites that just host content but don't allow user-generated communication. The Act then sets out a very comprehensive definition of 7 categories of harmful content that trigger the platform's new duties. These categories really define the scope of platform accountability.
Let's run through those 7 categories because they are the foundation. They define where Canada is drawing the line on what's unacceptable online.
Okay, first, we have intimate content communicated without consent. This is the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, and it's explicitly broadened to include deepfake photos or video recordings.
Yeah, what's second?
Second is content that sexually victimizes a child or re-victimizes a survivor. This includes visual representations of explicit sexual activity involving a child, or content that perpetuates harm against a survivor by resharing past exploitative content.
Okay, that one is aimed squarely at stopping the re-uploading and dispersal of known child sexual abuse material. And what about self-harm, addressing the youth mental health crisis?
That's third, content that induces a child to harm themselves. This is content that advocates self-harm, disordered eating, or suicide, and that could foreseeably cause a child to inflict injury or die by suicide.
And fourth, linking back the data we saw.
Is content used to bully a child? This means content communicated for the purpose of threatening, intimidating, or humiliating a child, causing serious harm to their physical or mental health. This is clearly aimed at that severe, persistent form of bullying impacting that 11% of youth.
Okay, so those are the more individual harms.
Yeah.
What about content that risks societal damage, hatred, violence, extremism?
Those are the final three. Fifth is content that foments hatred. Sixth is content that incites violence. And the seventh is content that incites violent extremism or terrorism. And that's defined broadly as content that could cause serious bodily harm, endanger a person's life, or cause a serious risk to public health or safety.
The breadth of that is astonishing. It covers everything from deeply personal violence like non-consensual images to massive public security risks like terrorism.
There's a huge scope.
Now, here's the crucial caveat that I think addresses some of the immediate public fear about the government becoming overly invasive. Does this act require platforms to proactively become content police, scouring every private message or actively searching for harmful content?
The Act tries to draw a clear line here. It's explicit that it does not generally require operators to proactively search for all content to identify harmful content.
But there's an exception.
There is a very important exception relating to the most heinous content. The Commission can make regulations requiring operators to adopt specific technologies like hashes to prevent the re-uploading of content related to child sexual victimization.
But otherwise, they don't have to look for it. Their duty kicks in when it's flagged or when their own systems identify a risk.
Correct.
So let's get into the structure of accountability. The duties imposed on these social media services, if they are the ones accountable, what exactly must they do?
There are three primary duties. The first and broadest is the duty to act responsibly, which is really the mechanism that defines the entire systems-based approach.
Tell us what negligence-based duty means in plain language. If I post something bad, is the platform liable?
It's not about the platform being liable for your post. It's about them being liable for their system. This duty means platforms must adopt adequate measures to mitigate the risk that users will be exposed to any of the 7 categories of harmful content. It's negligence-based because they have to show they took reasonable steps to design their services to prevent harm. If their system is demonstrably poor at controlling risk, if they were negligent in their design, they can be penalized.
So what does acting responsibly require, practically speaking? What do I see on the app? What are they doing behind the scenes?
It requires several concrete things. Platforms must implement user tools that allow blocking other users and easy mechanisms to flag harmful content. They must also make their user guidelines publicly available and accessible.
And they need a human contact point, right?
Critically, yes. They must designate a specific resource person who receives user complaints and directs users to internal resolution mechanisms and external supports, like law enforcement or mental health services.
And the accountability centerpiece seems to be this thing called the digital safety plan.
Absolutely. They have to develop and submit a detailed digital safety plan to the new commission. This plan has to articulate their risk assessments for each type of harm, detail the specific mitigation strategies they're embedding in their system, and explain how they evaluate the effectiveness of those strategies.
So they have to put their whole safety strategy on paper, publish it, and get it approved.
That's the idea. It forces transparency and regulatory oversight.
Okay, that seems to be the big regulatory hammer. What's the second duty? The one focusing on children.
The second is the duty to protect children. This is more forward-looking. It requires platforms to integrate any specific design features that are prescribed by future regulation. For instance, things like age-appropriate design or tools to limit content exposure for users identified as minors.
And the third duty is the most prescriptive one, the one with that non-negotiable hard deadline.
Right. This is the strongest directive in the Act, the duty to make certain content inaccessible, which everyone is calling the 24-hour rule. And crucially, this applies exclusively to the most egregious harms: child sexual victimization content and non-consensual intimate content, including deepfakes.
Let's look at the mechanism of that 24-hour rule because that's been widely discussed.
Yep.
How does it work and what due process is required?
So there are 2 timelines. First, if the content is detected by the platform itself, maybe using those hash matching tools, they have to make it inaccessible to Canadians within a strict 24 hours.
And if a user flags it?
If a user flags it, the process allows a brief window for assessment. The service has to conduct an initial assessment of that flag within the first 24 hours. If they decide the flag is valid and not, trivial or frivolous, they must then block the content within the following 24 hours.
So 48 hours maximum from the user flag, but due process is built in.
Yes, due process is mandated. Before a final decision to permanently block the content is made, the operator has to allow the original poster and the person who flagged it to make representations to the platform. It's designed to prevent instantaneous removal of potentially lawful speech.
To manage this entire massive framework, to enforce these duties and issue potentially ruinous penalties, the Act creates three brand new government bodies. This is a huge expansion of federal regulatory power.
It is a complete new infrastructure. The central body is the Digital Safety Commission of Canada. This is the regulator. Its job is to administer the framework, assess the adequacy of those platform measures, especially the digital safety plans, and enforce compliance.
And this commission is the one with the financial teeth.
Indeed, they are empowered to levy massive administrative monetary penalties. We are talking about fines up to 6% of the global revenues of the offending social media service for non-compliance.
6% of global revenues. That's designed to be catastrophic for large tech companies.
It ensures they treat the Canadian market seriously. The Commission also handles complaints regarding that most egregious content that falls under the 24-hour rule.
6%. I have to
Yeah.
pause here. That is an astronomical number for a major platform. Doesn't that immense financial threat create an incredibly powerful incentive for platforms to just censor aggressively to avoid the fine?
That is precisely the core constitutional critique, which we'll definitely delve into. But yes, that financial penalty is the incentive structure. The threat of a massive fine encourages over-removal, a chilling effect, where platforms choose to suppress borderline, potentially contentious but lawful speech simply to guarantee they are not penalized.
Okay, let's look at the other new bodies. We have the regulator and then we have the user advocate.
Correct. We have the Digital Safety Ombudsperson of Canada. This office is meant to be a vital resource for users and victims. Their role is advisory advocating for online safety, helping users navigate this complex new framework, and critically highlighting systemic issues that come up. They're the official consumer representative.
And finally, the administrative structure supporting them both.
That would be the Digital Safety Office of Canada, whose main job is to provide administrative support to both the Commission and the Ombudsperson, just to make sure this whole complex structure can operate smoothly. So this complex new administrative structure interacts with and amends existing federal law. And this raises an important question. How does the Act intersect with existing laws, especially around hate speech, and what constitutional challenges might this pose?
Let's start with defining and prohibiting hate speech, because this has always been a point of massive legal contention in Canada.
Yeah.
Balancing free expression against community protection. The new legislation is clearly trying to solidify exactly where that legal line is drawn.
Yes, and this is highly technical, but it's vital for the audience to grasp. Part 3 of Bill C-63 amends the Canadian Human Rights Act, the CHRA, which deals with discrimination. It prohibits communicating hate speech online or by any means of telecommunication in a context where it is likely to foment detestation or vilification of a person or group based on a prohibited ground of discrimination, like race, religion, or sexual orientation.
But not private messages.
Correct. This prohibition would not apply to private, one-to-one communication, only public-facing speech.
The legal terms, detestation or vilification. That sounds like the government is trying to legally anchor the definition of hate speech based on past Supreme Court rulings, setting a very high bar.
That is exactly what they are doing. They are explicitly codifying Supreme Court precedent. The bill creates a unified definition of hatred that applies to both the CHRA and the existing criminal code hate propaganda offenses. And the definition specifies that hatred involves detestation or vilification and does not mean mere disdain or dislike.
So in plain language, if your speech is merely offensive, rude, or even humiliating, it doesn't cross the threshold into illegal hate speech under this definition.
Yeah.
It has to reach that level of extreme loathing or dehumanization.
Precisely. The text further clarifies that communication does not incite hatred solely because it discredits, humiliates, hurts, or offends. This is a deliberate attempt to codify the high threshold from cases like Saskatchewan v. Whatcott.
So that seems like a responsible attempt to limit overreach. Now, let's address what has become the most controversial and highly criticized part of Bill C-63, the dramatic proposed changes to the criminal code regarding hate-motivated offenses.
This is where the debate gets really heated. Part 2 of Bill C-63 proposes a new hate motivation offense, and the sheer scope of this proposal is what's alarming critics.
What is the scope?
If any crime or federal offense, even minor existing offenses, is found to be motivated by hate, it could potentially trigger penalties up to life imprisonment.
Penalties up to life imprisonment for any hate-motivated crime. That is an enormous expansion of potential punitive power. Why would the government seek such an extreme measure, and why is it drawing such fierce opposition?
Well, the intention, presumably, is to send an unambiguous message of deterrence and denunciation. But civil liberties groups are alarmed by the sheer breadth of that penalty. Critics, like the BC Civil Liberties Association, argue that this expansion is unacceptable because it creates a gross disparity in justice.
Can you give us an example of how that disparity might manifest?
Sure, think about a teenager who spray paints racist graffiti on a wall. That's technically property damage, it may reflect recklessness. But under this, they could suddenly face penalties on par with murder, or worse than serious sexual assault, if that act is successfully proven to be hate-motivated.
So it risks making minor offenses punishable far more severely than major violent crimes.
Under certain circumstances, yes. And the risk isn't just about the severity of the sentence handed down, but about how that risk distorts the entire legal process.
How so?
The risk of life imprisonment, even if it's rarely imposed, significantly risks increasing the potential for wrongful convictions and coerced guilty pleas. An innocent person might be willing to plead guilty to a lesser, non-hate motivated charge, even if they're innocent of the whole thing, just to avoid the catastrophic risk of facing a potential life sentence at trial.
It puts immense pressure on defendants to forfeit their right to trial.
Exactly. It's a mechanism of pressure.
The government's defense, which often focuses on charter compliance, seems weak when faced with this critique.
The government has generally maintained that the process must comply with the charter, and that the structure of this new penalty is similar to existing provisions that have been found to be constitutional. But the severity of the potential penalty for offenses across the entire spectrum of federal law makes this expansion a huge constitutional tripwire for proportionality and fairness.
Okay, beyond the severity of penalties, the Act also adjusts how law enforcement gets data from service providers in specific circumstances. We need to look at the mandatory reporting and the engagement with privacy rights.
Right. This is about balancing police effectiveness with charter protections. The Act amends existing requirements for Internet service providers, ISPs, regarding mandatory reporting of child pornography offenses. Previously, they had to report the existence of the offense. Now, ISPs must also include transmission data in their reports when the content is manifestly child pornography.
What exactly is transmission data, and why is providing it to police considered an intrusion on privacy?
So, transmission data is specific metadata, information related to the routing of a communication, like the IP address, port number, date, time, and user authentication info. Importantly, it does not include the actual content of the communication, the substance, meaning, or purpose.
But that type of data is still considered highly sensitive.
It is. Providing this data to the state engages privacy interests protected under Section 8 of the Charter, the right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure. But the government is justifying this intrusion based on the compelling purpose of protecting children. Providing police with this transmission data immediately allows them to act more expeditiously to identify who is responsible for these serious exploitation offenses.
But how high is the threshold for this data sharing?
Yep.
Who makes the call on what is manifestly child pornography, and what happens if that power is misused?
That's the key safeguard, or at least the attempt at one. The threshold is high, requiring the content to be manifestly child pornography. That's intended to narrow the state's reach only to the most obvious and dangerous situations. But the concern remains. Who verifies this categorization, and what accountability exists if a mistake is made that infringes on an innocent user's Section 8 rights? It highlights that tightrope walk between security and civil liberties.
Ultimately, all of these mechanisms, the platform duties, the takedown deadlines, the new hate crime laws, they all have to stand up against one fundamental constitutional principle: freedom of expression. Can you clarify which part of the Charter governs this?
That is the central constitutional tension. Freedom of expression is protected under Section 2B of the Charter, and the duties imposed on the regulated platforms, the duty to act responsibly, the duty to make content inaccessible, the online hate speech prohibition, they all engage this because they require the platform, under threat of massive penalties, to police and potentially remove user speech.
How does the Act attempt to navigate this tightrope walk between safety and free expression?
Well, the Act tries to build in explicit safeguards to mitigate the inevitable chilling effect. It states that operators are not required to implement measures that unreasonably or disproportionately limit users' expression.
But the inherent challenge is profound.
It is. Any regulation of what appears on a public service will inevitably impact expression. As legal scholars argue, the economic logic driving platform content moderation, the need for profit and stability, often conflicts directly with human rights norms, particularly free speech.
And this brings us right back to that 6% fine. The risk of over-removal, the chilling effect, is constantly present.
It is the unavoidable byproduct of this regulatory model. When you're faced with the choice between a 6% global revenue fine and removing borderline, potentially contentious but lawful speech, the platform's financial imperative to avoid existential regulatory threats will almost certainly lead to suppression. The platform is incentivized to err heavily on the side of caution, prioritizing risk management over expression rights.
This whole approach is philosophically described as a systems-based regulatory framework. It really feels like a massive philosophical shift from how governments used to think about online speech. Let's look deeper at the philosophy driving Bill C-63 and the core critical concerns that have been raised.
The shift is fundamental, and it mirrors global trends in digital governance. Academic thought suggests that online regulation needs to move beyond simply reviewing individual objectionable posts after they're flagged, which is sort of the first wave of regulation. Instead, we have to move to a second wave that employs systems thinking.
What does that mean in practical terms? Shifting from an individual post to regulating a system.
It means focusing on patterns and interrelationships and the underlying architecture of the platform, rather than the reactive ex-post review of content. The Online Harms Act aligns perfectly with this.
How so?
By imposing that negligence-based duty and, crucially, by requiring platforms to submit those detailed digital safety plans. This mandates that platforms assess their systemic risks, how their algorithms, moderation practices, and reporting tools create or mitigate harm, and then detail the mitigation strategies they have structurally embedded. Accountability shifts from, did you take down this one bad post, to, is your platform designed to be safe?
It sounds like the government is forcing platforms to internalize the cost and the mechanism of regulation, making them responsible for the environment they create. Is Canada alone in adopting this systems-based approach?
Far from it. This new Canadian framework is very similar to global precedents. We see strong parallels in the EU's Comprehensive Digital Services Act and the UK's Online Safety Act. All three frameworks share a common DNA,
Which is?
placing systems-based obligations on digital services that connect consumers to content. It's a recognition that the scale of modern social media requires regulating the system, the architecture, and the algorithms, rather than attempting to police every single user post globally.
Okay, moving to the critiques. Despite widespread consultation that was meant to address concerns over censorship and overregulation of speech, there remains significant concern from civil liberties advocates that this model could have serious unintended consequences.
The primary worry, as we touched on, is the danger of privatized censorship. Critics fear that a model so disproportionately focused on preventing harmful content, particularly when combined with that existential threat of massive penalties, could function as a blueprint for privatized government censorship.
They worry the government is just outsourcing the dirty work of speech policing to private, profit-driven companies.
That's the fear. The platform, fearing that huge fine, simply takes down anything remotely controversial.
And that's the financial imperative.
That's the financial imperative. The economic logic driving platform content moderation often conflicts directly with human rights norms. The more robust the governmental safety policy, the more hands-on and invasive the platform's approach becomes, creating this unsettling trade-off that's sort of sewn into the logic of the internet.
The platforms are no longer neutral conduits. They are legally compelled and financially incentivized arbitrators of speech. There's a fascinating historical analogy used by scholars to criticize this reductionist approach to content moderation. The analogy from 19th century social medicine. Can you elaborate on that? It's a powerful philosophical criticism.
It involves the renowned 19th century physician Rudolf Virchow. During a typhus epidemic in Silesia, Virchow argued that the problem wasn't just the individual symptoms of the illness. The root cause was the broader social conditions: poor sanitation, poverty, lack of education. He famously declared that medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale.
He said physicians were the natural attorneys of the poor.
He did. He insisted that societal health required addressing the underlying structure and power dynamics, not just treating individuals ex post.
Applying that thinking to online harms.
The analogy suggests that simply removing content policing the individual symptom of a toxic online environment is insufficient. Regulations should address the root social and environmental signals, creating the online toxicity.
The underlying social and technical conditions that foster hate and in use.
Right. Relying solely on platform content moderation, the content removal approach, may contain the symptoms without solving the systemic social disease of online toxicity and polarization.
On that note of systemic issues, a significant criticism has also been raised regarding the enforcement of existing laws versus the creation of these harsh new criminal penalties we discussed.
That's the enforcement gap argument, which is a major point of skepticism for civil liberties advocates. Critics contend that existing hate laws and prohibitions are simply not being enforced due to a lack of police resources or prioritization.
So, introducing dramatically harsher criminal penalties won't resolve the underlying issue if police and prosecutors are prioritizing resources elsewhere.
That's the argument. The issue, they say, is not the lack of law, but the lack of commitment to applying the laws already on the books.
This suggests that a legal solution on its own is fundamentally inadequate. What alternative or complementary approaches are the sources recommending to solve the actual problem of online toxicity rather than just treating the symptoms?
The sources strongly reinforce that an effective response has to be multifaceted. It cannot rely solely on legal tools or platform moderation. We have to emphasize non-legal approaches, primarily education and digital citizenship.
So we need to empower the users themselves, much like we saw with that high rate of bystander intervention. Teach the user, not just punish the platform.
Exactly. This requires fostering a culture shift that promotes human rights and digital literacy from a young age. Specific recommendations have been made for provincial school curriculums, for example in BC, to include developmentally appropriate learning objectives on cyberbullying, emotional resilience, and digital citizenship.
We need to teach kids how to use the technology responsibly and how to be effective bystanders.
And furthermore, the social media companies must play a transparent role, making their terms of use and reporting mechanisms transparent, clear, and understandable, especially for young users. This concept of clear notification, complaints, openness is essential so that users know exactly how to seek help or report content without being overwhelmed by opaque, confusing processes.
This deep dive has exposed the immense complexity of trying to govern a medium that was never designed for governance. We started with the urgent data on youth experiences, the prevalence of meanness, the analog reliance on parents, and the confusing cyclical reality of that bully-victim dynamic.
And we've analyzed the mechanics of the Online Harms Act, Bill C-63. It's an ambitious attempt to pivot towards a systems-based negligence model of regulation, imposing heavy duties, from detailed risk mitigation plans to the 24-hour takedown rule on platforms regarding those 7 defined categories of harm.
And at the same time, we've highlighted the contentious criminal amendments and the foundational tension with charter rights, especially freedom of expression, which requires extremely delicate navigation.
The fundamental tension remains.
We have the absolute necessity of protecting vulnerable users, especially children, countered by the risks inherent in delegating massive content moderation power to profit-driven corporations, and the chilling impact they could have on fundamental rights like free speech and open debate. It's a necessary framework, perhaps, but one that's fraught with philosophical and practical dangers.
We have a comprehensive legislative proposal that tries to codify hate, speed up the removal of egregious content, and compel transparency. But the core challenge is balancing that economic incentive for censorship, the need to avoid fines, with the philosophical mandate to protect all legal expression, even that which is offensive or discrediting.
That leaves us with a provocative thought for you to consider as you reflect on this new legislative environment. If platforms are now forced, under penalty of ruinous fines reaching 6% of global revenues, to become the primary government-sanctioned arbitrators of online safety and legal compliance, what accountability structures beyond these regulatory fines must we, the public, demand to ensure that the economic incentive to censor content doesn't inadvertently suppress crucial, albeit offensive, dissenting speech?
The line between necessary safety and dangerous overreach is razor thin, and Canada is now firmly staking its claim on one side.